In a mid-sized city within an average suburb sits a house that from the street looks like any other. Inside one enters a mirror world. On the left side of the staircase, one bedroom that was once the master now looks like a bachelor pad, complete with abstract modern sculptures on the right side of the staircase. The former guest room now looks more like a master bedroom and has a painting of a romantic landscape above the bed. In the kitchen, you will find two of everything, two coffee makers, two sets of dishes, two entirely different meals in the fridge. It is not a house divided, but a home that refuses to unite. One summer day, Betty Henderson lowered her coffee mug to the right side of the sink, next to the cabinet with her coffee mugs, above where her coffee maker a Braun gave off the last steam of the new pot of bold roast. On the left side, the Keurig belonging to her official husband and roommate, Ron, waited for its first use of the day, with something hazelnut blackberry inside. Sighing, she picked up her car keys and called up the stairs. "I'm off." No response. "Don't wait up for me," she said, then broke into a giggle that ended with a sob before she fell silent for her lonely drive. Things had not always been this way. Entropy and decay happen, she knew, but it seemed that people were often too willing to let it. Allowing everything to go downhill made it easier to avoid doing the things that they should be doing. Speaking of sudden mortality, she changed lanes to be out of the left lane of the freeway, which ran dangerously close to the Sassafras Road Bridge and its middle pillar, which formed a solid block of concrete between the lanes. If you just drifted left a hair, the end came quickly. The gray rectangle marked the far end of a nice straightaway where people could get their cars up to speed, and 6 had died in an uncontainable fire that year so far. Her story began in a similar anonymous suburb many years ago. Born to a university professor and his high school teacher wife, Betty Jansen grew up in a house where the adults were constantly busy. They each graded the papers for their own classes, then met up for a glass of wine before bed, while the children Betty and her older brothers David, Philip, and Julian did their homework at the identical desks in their rooms. When she had free time, Betty liked to paint. She frequently painted romantic scenes, like stormy mountain passes or Gothic castles shrouded in mist, and imagined herself living in them instead of her dreary, obedient household stranded in the cookie-cutter suburbs. She wondered what her painting, the painting of her life and how her story would end, would look like once she got old enough to make her own decisions. Her parents gave her no direction mainly because they focused so much on her older siblings. The boys were good at sports in school, and all the adults seemed to fawn over them. Betty was assumed to be just, well, Betty, a tidy little person who liked to paint and sing, had big dreams, and would find a place somewhere. "Will I grow up to have a castle someday, or a prince?" she asked her mother. Betty was painting her favorite scene, a radiant castle in the mountains, rich with spring green and Empyrean azure above a field of white flowers. "No, dear, you'll become a functioning member of society, develop your own career, pay taxes, and have an accomplished husband, so we have grandkids to visit," said her mother. "What your mother said, dear," her father murmured, barely looking up from the papers he was grading. Her parents, as she remembered them, were attired in bold browns and subdued reds. On weekends, her father liked to golf, her mother hike, and the two would meet up on Saturday night for a date night that involved dinner, drinks, dancing, and a movie. They both liked artsy movies, but she knew they sometimes guiltily went to see a good, thrilling movie. She imagined that, on that one day a week, they spent quality time together. She had no idea what went on in their room at the end of the hall. It was a loving home and a safe one, but not an affectionate home. While her brothers went to highly ranked colleges, Betty, who had good grades but not exceptional aptitude test scores, barely got a scholarship to the state university down the road. When she announced her engagement to Ron her senior year of college, after a long and steady romance beginning when they shared a group project in an early economics class, her parents barely nodded before returning to their books. Her brothers had married well or were engaged, and while the first of these events was exciting, the last was measured more in terms of how much free time it took from their comfortable middle-aged lives. She married Ron because he seemed to fit into the painting that she hoped would portray her life, maybe not a prince, but a strong, silent man, loving his devoted wife, in a castle ensconced in a valley surrounded by mountains, or at least a nice part of suburbia. To this, she added 2 things. First, she borrowed from what her parents wanted and decided that her man needed to be accomplished, either by success or being an innovator. Second, on top of this vision floated her own unarticulated dream. She wanted someone to spend time with who actually wanted to be with her, who was affectionate, and appreciated her as more than just a kid with above-average grades and adequate performance on the field hockey team. Betty did not want to be like her mother and father were. "Hey, is this seat taken?" Ron had said. Betty looked up and saw not a football hero, but the mythical well-rounded, all-American, a guy who was obviously both fit, being on the swim team, and going somewhere, since his research in the computer science department had already made it into at least one newspaper. They had met in her Econ 101 class, where he seemed to have a good grasp of the material but was slightly bored, revealing a shadow of arrogance behind his friendliness. "No, go ahead," said Betty, and turned back to watching the game, even though she considered football about as exciting as watching traffic. One light changes, the cars go ahead, and then the lights change again, and cars from the other side go. If someone tosses a ball out of a panel van and the person in the station wagon catches it, they drive straight down the street and everyone cheers. If not, repeat. "I didn't realize that you are a painter," said Ron. "I had a bad date last night and ended up in the art center after too many drinks, just looking at paintings. I saw this one that took my breath away. It took ordinary colors and made them glow," he said with a warm smile. "I like to paint things that give me hope," said Betty, then steered the conversation toward his hopes. That strong jaw caused her a bit of a flutter in her stomach, and his deep voice curled around her like a warm cat on a winter evening. He also seemed not just accomplished but quietly powerful, and he liked her paintings. She made sure to offer her number. She canceled everything unnecessary, her volunteer activities, nights out with her friend group, and a call home to her parents, and lived in her pajamas while she learned the software. She had never worked hard on anything this much before, in terms of giving it her complete attention, noting every detail, and measuring the quality of the outcome so severely. After a week, she had redesigned the website for Ron's startup company, and it both looked like a solid corporate site and nothing like anything else out there. "I wasn't a big fan of that spring green and gold color scheme at first," said Ron. "I thought we wanted the bold colors red, black, orange, blue, but it works. I'll run it by my partners and see." Life settled back into normal. She attended classes, wrote papers, studied for tests, and showed up for psychology department meetings. On Saturday night, they always went out on a date, which, since neither of them had much money, meant hitting a movie at the local mall, getting coffee at the independent bookshop in the little town surrounding the college, and then enjoying a meal at the all-night Mexican restaurant just outside of city limits. By the time junior year rolled around, Ron and Betty were an item with an asterisk by it. She had never asked if they were exclusive, but they were both too busy for anyone else to be in the picture. The asterisk said that they were both seeming to fall into the same trajectory toward marriage, kids, and a bright future. No one had mentioned love, but neither of them were very sentimental, and they seemed to be moving in the direction of family. "We have to talk," said Ron one Wednesday afternoon as he walked her home from class. Sunlight speckled through the trees above in the midst of a Central Texas spring. "I'm leaving the university. My startup needs to move now, and staying in school just delays that for 2 years. I'll come back and do night classes." "Okay," said Betty. He looked pained. "You don't need to change anything. Just ... say that you're not breaking up with me because of it." "I would never do that," she said. "I'm become quite fond of you. You're my Prince Charming, just a very practical one, and I'm proud of your work." He sighed in relief. "Good, because I think I'm rather fond of you too, Betty. In fact, I think I love you." She was not ready to say back those words, but opted for a political compromise. "I'm very near that as well. Let's see how it goes for the next few months." Something dark passed over his eyes, a light gray that she always found hard to interpret and appealing at that moment, but it was gone quickly. Ron had grown up like her in a family of high achievers surrounded by the roughnecks and transients of the Abilene oil fields, which meant that he had never felt particularly special and feared the loss of affection, esteem, and dedication. "I understand," he said finally, with a slight lump in his throat as if he was hit by emotion. But like most people, he recovered quickly. "Let's get a coffee and plan the future." They planned she would do all the artwork, he would write all the code, and his mentor, a former professor, would handle the business side. Ron owned half the company. He wanted to retire in his 30s and travel the world. He didn't mention her he would have if she had said she loved him, but he hoped it would be so. His early life having been devoid of affection and filled with competition, he wanted something he could trust as the basis of his future and family. Maybe it was her. It turned out that she did all the artwork, he wrote all the code, and his mentor, a former professor, tried to steal the company. It made a ton of money, and while Ron owned half of it, his mentor had control through his role as CEO. After a lengthy battle that occupied most of his 30s, Ron gained control through other executives supporting him, since their product was popular and could grow bigger if someone with more business experience took over. Exit the mentor, enter the professionals. Ron traveled the world, but only to give talks at foreign universities. Ron's firm made a product that Betty barely understood. He described it as a computer program which spread tasks to other computers and made sure that they could get the data they needed, all while watching for anomalies that indicated a hack, hardware failure, or that a recent change was not working. At first a competitor in a crowded market, it improved once Ron could turn his focus away from corporate affairs towards systematic improvement in the product. Soon it dominated the industry. By the time they hit their 30s, they were established, sort of. They had a nice house in Georgetown and his company was doing great things, but all of their money was tied up in the stocks that cemented his ownership. For a while they got by on her private practice offering counseling to marriages, depressed teenagers, and lonely people. Their 4 children appeared to be doing well in school, and unexpectedly they celebrated with a bottle of wine as the sun descended below the wide Texas horizon. "I love you, Ron," she said softly, at one point realizing that other than at moments where she was prompted to say this, their wedding, date night, ending phone calls, she rarely said, "I know," he said. "I have loved you for a long time, as well." Within another decade, cracks appeared in the image of the perfect life. They never managed to travel the world. Their children were growing up and sprinting away, each with his or her own mountains to climb, and as the house became increasingly empty, they had nothing to distract from a growing sense of emptiness within their relationship. Or rather, with their initial goal accomplished, their careers had taken the place of family, love, and affection. Betty frequently arrived late and stayed late to catch patients who could only fit in appointments in the evening. Like her husband, she put in long work weeks. Ron traveled frequently, and they often saw each other only on date night and for random errands and watching shows on Netflix on Sunday. On paper, their lives were good, but like the phrases in theory and in the abstract. The idea of something being on paper meant an abstraction that was a phantom of the human brain, not part of the world out there where we could not directly control it. Abstraction was addictive, she recalled from her early psychology classes, and could become somewhat of a rabbit trail, leading away from reality entirely. What happens in the lab often tells only part of the story. "You're looking worn," boss said her receptionist Erin one afternoon. Betty found this hard to believe in theory. She was getting her 8 hours of sleep a night, but something had been nagging at her, something she could not put her finger upon. Something was amiss, even in the fairy tale she had painted for herself, which fell short of what she had originally wanted. "Probably just feeling a bit down," Betty replied. "Calendar's light for the rest of the week," Erin mentioned. They had seen quite a few cancellations for the holiday weekend. "Why don't you go somewhere? Maybe take a vacation?" Betty found that idea quite entertaining. Vacations were for people with lots of time and money. On paper, they had lots of money. In reality, things were often tighter than she wanted to admit, but she splurged on a ticket to New Orleans, where her husband was attending a conference. Perhaps it was time to reconnect and start mending those cracks. However, when Betty walked into the lobby of the grand old hotel she knew her husband favored, she could not reach him on his cell phone. At the desk, they gave her a room key, and with the same confidence she displayed with her patients, she strode right into the room without knocking. At that moment, her face fell. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence by saying that this is not what it looks like, that it's just a mistake, that I'll come home with a stronger love, or that she doesn't matter to me," said Ron slowly, his voice gentler than Betty suspected it would be. "We've grown apart. Our picture is out of focus. I'm lonely, and I found comfort with someone else." Betty looked from one face to another and back again. Everyone seemed to be waiting on her, but in her mind, there was not much to say. "I'm sorry I interrupted," she said finally. "I'll be around for the next hour if you want to talk at some point." She left the room, keeping her professional composure and congratulating herself on handling the situation with maturity as she walked back down the plush carpeted hall. She settled down in the lobby, staring out into space as she collected her thoughts. As a counselor, she frequently had to give advice, but rarely had to live it. Her response felt empty, as if she showed how little love she had for her husband by reacting calmly to the revelation. On the other hand, she wondered what else she would do in her experience. Dramatic displays of emotion usually showed how unsure a person was of their feelings, and they tried to convince themselves of their emotions by acting them out. Her practice had shown her this path of infidelity many times. At first, she counseled the approach that humans should treat infidelity like any other mistake and include the deception and lack of respect as part of the act of cheating. Her clients usually saw it the other way around, which was that when someone decided to lie and cheat on their partner, respect had been lost and was unlikely to return. She remembered a few cases of a very open-minded woman who believed that by acting as a married couple again, the two could overcome the infidelity of the husband. At first, this went well, until one day the husband was a half-hour late from a trip to the hardware store. At this point, cognitive dissonance kicked in. The wife could either admit that this path was not working or rationalize it as good by embracing the behavior. The couple decided to have an open relationship, but it eventually fell apart when the husband realized they were more like roommates with benefits, leading to a painful divorce. Another man could be described as an entrepreneur and viewed his life through this filter, so saw the cheating as an attempt to renegotiate the marriage. He put an end to the renegotiation, worked on rebuilding their relationship, and spent another decade focusing on being a devoted husband and father. This approach collapsed when the wife discovered that he had been cheating again. Their marriage dissolved in a bitter divorce, leaving their children emotionally scarred and struggling in their personal lives. The third case was told to her by a very conventional woman, church-going and active in a number of social causes, who immediately recognized that with her husband cheating, she no longer had a partner but an enemy within the gates. She chose to end the marriage, which was quick and quiet, and focused on rebuilding her life. Though she did not remarry or date, she found peace and happiness within herself, and her children seemed to have grown into successful adults, even though they rarely discussed their personal lives with her or their father. These seemed to her to be her options reconcile, but realized that trust was gone, or acknowledged the loss of trust and split up. The former seemed more complicated, since of almost a dozen couples that she knew had tried it, only 2 were still together, and wariness seemed to be the mood in those homes. The latter might break her heart more than the infidelity. As she cautioned her clients, ask yourself if you would be happier with your partner or without them. Betty reflected that she did not know. This led to another thought, which was that she had been living without her partner for some time. The few hours when they were not working went by quickly with the little tasks of daily life: cleaning, laundry, paying bills, shopping, cooking, calling friends and relatives, to the point that they might be spending an hour or less per week actually together like a married couple. It seemed to her as if they were each cheating, but with their social status, which they romanced through careers and professional contacts. "Hello," Betty said, Ron, startling her out of her thoughts. "Oh, hello," she said, looking up into his eyes for a trace of the warmth that she once saw. It was there, lingering behind an emotion she knew as resentment, a cold burn. This frequently came up with her clients who had trouble with alcohol and gambling. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "No, you don't," said Betty quickly. "We have not had much of a marriage for some time, and part of it is my fault. I let you drift away because I was busy drifting and spent too much time at the office." "Yeah," he said gruffly. "I always felt that your little lost lambs, adrift in the seas of addiction and heartbreak, got the best of your love." He stopped, uncertain of how much to continue. "I understand," she said. "What is done is done. Do you want to separate?" Ron pondered. He colored when he realized that if he could choose anything, he would choose what he had before Betty discovered his affair. He had a nice public life with a partner to show off, a story of unbroken successes that he used to promote himself, and then for the 6 weekends a year when he needed it. Samantha expected nothing from him except that he pay for their luxurious accommodations, outings and meals when he was in town, and he expected nothing from her other than a lack of STDs. For a moment, Ron saw a flash of a realization before his mind shut down to keep it out. In that brief shimmering vision, he realized that he might be self-absorbed because working with science and computers gave him a sense of superiority, and he had finally believed his own arrogance. He deflated a bit, having seen himself, and before it blocked out the thought, his inner voice told him that this self-centeredness was the real issue, and that he had really cheated himself of being the kind, strong, and good person he had always wanted to be. Struggling against guilt, he said quickly, "No, I do not want to separate. I want to work through this. At least this would buy time." Betty watched the conflict swim across his face and decided that she should apply some of her professional knowledge, quoting from her psychological dictionary entry for cognitive dissonance. Dissonance theory holds that when a person encounters a disconnect between expectations and reality, They must reconcile the two inputs by reducing one of them. They will either change their expectations, making them subordinate to what is observed, or alter their perceptions of reality, distorting what they know to be true in order to remove the conflicting data. She knew that her partner had thought he was happy and happily in love until he had an opportunity to be unfaithful, at which point he blamed the relationship instead of facing his own unhappiness. She formulated a simple strategy to help him realize his unhappiness until he saw the value of their relationship together. Unlike many partners portrayed in internet fiction, Betty was neither promiscuous nor naive, and although she got only medium scores because of test anxiety, had a high IQ and the unusually sensitive perception of an artist. She acted pragmatically but with a long-term focus. "Well then, I will see you back at home," she said. "We'll have to make some changes, of course, but you have nothing to fear from me." I never said it when we were dating. Something I later learned was born of my fear that I would end up like my own family of origin. But I love you more than life itself, and I have wasted too much of my time. Really, our time with my demanding job, something I now regret. Holding her head as high as could be expected, Betty walked out the door into the bright sunlight, got into the waiting cab, and went back to the airport, where she spent a desultory 4 hours until she caught a standby flight home. She held it together until she got inside the door and had locked it, then collapsed in a maelstrom of tears, sobbing so hard that she retched and vomited. Science did not recognize it, she thought, but there might be a heart or a soul. And hers had just broken in 3 layers on the surface, the cheating itself. Part of this was social fear. It was embarrassing to feel betrayed, and doubly so to have failed at one of the major tasks in life that tests the strength of the participants, a committed relationship. She also feared for her children and what it would do to them to believe that the coming together of the people whose DNA made them had been a mistake. It would be like rejecting their very origins. In here, she kept a small room in her mind for herself, and in this room she would always be weeping until she vomited, heartbroken that in her life, love had flown. Just below the surface, the mental health issue. Somehow, 2 intelligent and capable people had either deluded themselves into a committed relationship or out of it. Which was the error? This formed a jagged crisis like a splinter of ice in not just her heart, but her analytical mind. Something very wrong had happened. Even in the best-case scenario, the two had decided to give themselves fully to their careers instead of love, family, and happiness. It felt like a cold wind on her shoulders, the presence of a ghost, or perhaps a shadow, were she to believe in such antiquated superstitions. Deep below her conscious mind, the revelations about each of them. She felt like Ron must have when Samantha experienced a mishap during one of their encounters. She had seen something unpleasant there which would forever be associated with him, a desire for revenge and what seemed like an ugly self-centeredness, the excessive arrogance that caused people to pretend they were superior or scientific progress itself. In herself, on the other hand, she saw a willful denial of the efforts of affection that had produced a home as devoid of affection as that of her parents. It was easy to stop crying. She remembered from her training in psychology that most people cry for themselves, and the act of crying convinces them that they have been wronged by life or another person, which makes it easier for them to feel bad and therefore to keep crying instead of facing whatever conflict has come their way. Her problem was that she did not want to. She needed this release of the dark energy hiding inside her, and maybe a feeling like holding her teddy bear close under her favorite blanket when she failed a test, during a thunderstorm, or when she was ill as a child. 2 days later, Ron returned home. He had gone back to the hotel room to pack, but then realized that he was going to pay the price either way, so he should just enjoy his weekend. After all, at this point to him, Betty represented everything that he had to do in life, like the job that produced endless demands, even just the 10,000 little problems that cropped up every week which only he could address, since he did not trust others. Betty was stability, conformity, and the endless rules like taking off his muddy shoes and not drinking more than 6 beers a night. Forget that. He turned to Samantha with a smile and a trembling feeling. Betty had spent the time thinking, reflecting on what the entrepreneur had told her. She wanted cognitive dissonance to work for her like prisoners of war, who were treated well. Being treated cordially by the cheating partner had a tendency to force the cheater to realize their mistake, but she also wanted economic psychology to work in her favor. That is, she wanted to make it less painful for him to reconcile than to keep deceiving her. Where should I put my stuff?" Ron was asking sheepishly. She reflected that, Like most people who wanted the stable relationship to go back to after their moments of passion and lust, Ron was not so much seeking another relationship as he was seeking something that he could not get or was afraid to get at home. Why would he be afraid? Betty blushed when she thought about how confident her psychological knowledge, career acclaim and awards, and power as the head of the household had made her. Perhaps she had unintentionally become the type of person she called demanding. A gentle response was required. "It's good that you're home, sweetie. Everything here is the same, for you," she said. "I have divided the house to signify where we stand, for now, which is that without my recognizing it, we became at odds with each other, so I have taken the east side of the house, with the guest room and dining room and half of the kitchen, while you have the west side, with the den and master bedroom as well as your half of the kitchen. We'll have to share the fridge, of course," she added. "And let me say," she continued, "it is wonderful to have you home. You are the person I have always loved. I want us to get past this and to be not what we once were, but what we can be, now that we realize that there were issues, really, problems, our own self-deception with what we were. We can be better than we have been, both recently and for the whole of our marriage." Exhausted without reason, she paused. His eyes swam, unsure of where to focus. From her study of clients, this meant that they were unsure of whether to invent a fiction looking down to the left, falsely portray honesty, meet the eyes, nod the head, vigorous gestures, speak from memory looking up to the right, admit where their view of reality had been mistaken looking straight down, distance themselves from the issue looking straight up, moving back, or say something they feared to bring up looking straight ahead, but below eye contact. "Thanks," he said, trailing off, "for being so mature about all of this. I don't know how you do it." "I'm thinking of the future, honey," said Betty. She wanted to get in as many affectionate diminutives as she could. The angel on her right shoulder wanted him to feel as accepted as possible, and the devil on her left wanted him to recognize what he was missing. Ron took his stuff upstairs. The master bedroom looked stark without the clothes, perfumes, books, makeup, and toiletries that his spouse customarily scattered about, since women require 6 dozen implements to get ready in the morning, where a man needs a toothbrush, comb, and bar of soap towel optional, in most cases. He sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hand for quite some time. "Henderson, what the heck was that?" It was back in the 1990s, and Ron's coach towered over him, standing on the edge of the pool while Ron floated in the water below. "It's just a practice run," said Ron. "Coach, it's been a long week," and Coach Moffat flung down his clipboard. The clatter on the pool edge both startling other swimmers and being a familiar sound. "Henderson," he said, "you gotta have the mentality of a champion. You gotta win in your head first. It's all mental. You have to want to make each strong perfect, to keep your rhythm, to put all of your energy into moving efficiently down the pool. You're not here today. Your head is in the clouds. Get out and come back when you're ready to win." Ron heaved himself out of the water. The look he gave the coach had fire, but it was a dark fire. He resented the man for having caught him underperforming and for having diagnosed so expertly his crisis. Ron's head was wrapping itself around money and technology, fame and renown, not trying to be the best second stringer on his high school swim team. He wasn't going to the Olympics, but he would use this activity to get into college, and that was all he cared about. In that moment, Ron decided that his coach was wrong, and as he showered after practice, he reflected on how much better he knew than the angry old guy whose best career prospect was yelling at stubborn teenagers, all of whom were snidely using this as a springboard to college. Not a pursuit in itself. He did not love swimming, nor did he love his hometown, his parents, his country, or even life. Life, he decided, was nasty, brutish, and short as Thomas Hobbes had said, and the only revenge on that was living well, and that in turn required money. "Too bad," Henderson coach said without looking up from his clipboard as Ron packed up to leave. "You could have been someone. You could have been a hero to yourself." That night, lying in bed, Ron decided that he could be a hero to himself, but not by pitting his mind against its own lack of discipline in the water. He wanted to be a rich, powerful person with a trophy spouse who was living the 1990s dream, not just wealth, but a career that was meaningful and social justice activities to show the world how good he and his spouse were inside. Even if he did not believe it, he could act the part, at least in the business world, if not the swimming pool. And so, time went on for the divided house. Betty went to her job, but cut back on the number of evening appointments. Surprisingly, her clients were able to reschedule despite their previous protestations. With the office running 8 hours a day on the nose, her staff perked up as well, and Betty found herself with more time for the things she had once neglected. The bedroom above the dining room was draped in tarps, and an easel appeared out of nowhere. One night she came downstairs and Ron, without saying anything, wiped the dot of paint from her nose, as he had done in the past. They shared a laugh, but then silence came and stayed. Ron, too, had cut back on his work hours. He finally accepted that he had been micromanaging and started to delegate. This let him rethink their product line. That in turn allowed him to see how their products could expand to take on even more roles. And by adding an easy GUI, he took away the requirement of having highly paid super engineers make the product work. He democratized it so that your average sort of technologically literate middle manager or overnighted support person could use his tools. "Good night," boss said Aaron as Betty headed out the door. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson. Can I ask a quick question?" "Sure," Aaron said Betty, a smokiness coming over her eyes as she readied herself for a query about her marriage. "It's for my night school," said Aaron with a slight twist to her mouth and an apologetic gesture. "We have to write about differences in grieving between men and women." Betty went to her bookshelf and pulled down a volume here and there for a few minutes, then handed the stack to Aaron. "I knew she'd do that," Aaron told her roommates later. "It's so like her. But this basically gave me a bibliography to add to our assigned reading. I'm going to do great on this one. It's not common to say this, Aaron," said Betty, "but men and women are psychologically different. Men are oriented toward a goal and minimums. They want to know what are the things they must do in order to have a life they like, and they guess that they will figure out the rest when the time comes. Women are oriented toward a situation or having all the details aligned to make a picture or a diorama of the perfect life. They figure that they will respond to needs as this happens, and those are their goals. When their attempts fail, men figure that they have the wrong goal and try for something new, different, or contrary to what they were doing. Male grief takes on the form of retaliation often. Women assume that something is out of place since they are content as they are, and must simply say yes or no to offers from men, at least insofar as making a family goes. Romance is the primal motivator, but that's only because over time people gravitate toward family in order to have a sense of satisfaction in life. Female grief becomes a search for the betrayer, the detail that went wrong. She continued, this means that while a man will decide he was betrayed, a woman will decide that she was insufficient. For some reason she was broken, therefore the details were all wrong. The man does not question himself, but finds someone to blame, usually someone who is guilty, when really he needs to reconsider his own needs. The woman rejects her needs and concludes that she is wrong, so she tries to remake herself and becomes a perfect little actor, trying to portray a life that she could like. Aaron made a few notes. "Thanks, Teach," she said. They rode down in the elevator together, talking about little things, each grateful for the distraction. The divided house carried on. Every morning, Betty would rise in her own bedroom, wash up in the hall bathroom, and make herself coffee while microwaving a Danish and then head off to work. While she was in the kitchen, Ron was in the shower, and he left the empty house after making himself coffee in his Keurig on the west side of the kitchen. Then he got in his Porsche, a treat he had gotten himself a few years back when their IPO hit the news, and drove off to the office. On weekends, they amused themselves. Neither worked Saturdays any longer. Ron had not mowed the lawn in years, paying a service instead, but now took pride in making nice even rows and trimming the edges expertly. He tried the couch potato lifestyle, watching a bunch of Hulu and Netflix, but gave up after finding the programs and movies to be too similar to each other to really care about. He read more, restarted his jogging regimen, and started learning gourmet cooking. Betty painted, took long walks, and plinked around on the old piano the kids had left in the garage. They tried date night, but the silences killed it. They ran out of everyday topics, and the monster loomed in the negative space of what was not mentioned. After the food was gone and the wine drunk, they would pick at dessert plates, Ron wondering why he chose this path, Betty wondering what was so wrong with her that she could not keep to it. Then they would depart, pull up to the empty house, politely wish each other good night, and retire to their rooms. Samantha had made it easy for Ron. After Betty left the hotel room, the younger woman tidied up the place and ordered a white wine from room service. She knew that Ron would be in a troubled state of mind. It surprised her when, after making excuses and going to see his wife once the shock wore off, he appeared again in the door as if nothing had happened. When she got back to her home in Los Angeles, Samantha changed her number and deleted her social media profiles. Betty fought herself over the urge to investigate, but eventually gave in and began searching online to find any mention of Ron Henderson and Samantha. She found the woman on a picture page for a conference 4 years prior, labeled as a promotional manager for one of the other firms in the field. Betty could not find an email address and saw the inactive social media profiles, but found a number through the directory at Samantha's workplace. She wrote it down and stared at the post-it note often, wanting to know the truth but feeling unsure about calling. "She's too nice," Ron said, talking to his brother Greg on his boat in the lake one weekend. "She would talk about it if I brought it up, but she keeps just being Betty, I guess. She's sweet to me but distant." Greg, a confirmed bachelor, nodded and suppressed his first impulses. "Guess she wants you back," he said. "I take it, to be fair. Betty's blind to a lot. Heck, she'd have to be with parents like hers, but she loves you." "She doesn't show it," said Ron, musing that none of them, Greg, Betty, or Ron, were really in contact with their parents. His had gone off on a tour of the world years ago, and he stayed in touch by phoning them at their Florida condo on holidays. Betty wrote her parents a card for their birthday and never got a reply. "People can be complex," said Greg. "When things go badly, they blame themselves, so they distance themselves until you fight for them again, but then they become demanding because you have proven their worth. I guess that's why I date and leave them." On Monday, Ron left work late and parked his Porsche outside Roman Holiday, the local bar his engineers often mentioned as a pickup place. He got himself a non-alcoholic drink and waited. Soon enough, he had female companionship and conversation. It was only when he came home, the memory of one passionate hug at the bar lingering, that he realized he'd done it again. He had betrayed his emotions, if not with his whole self, at least with a part of his heart. When he went back to the house, he did not see Betty. For a moment, he wondered if he had finally done it and broken their relationship beyond repair. Then, he heard the sound of a paintbrush being rinsed in a jar of paint thinner from upstairs, and the smell of oil paints wafted down the stairs. His empty bedroom, the master that they had once shared, beckoned to him, so he slipped inside quietly, showered, and went to bed. The next day he woke up, expecting a major change, but it was just an ordinary day in the divided house. Over the next few days, each retreated into their own thoughts. Ron began to question whether he wanted to be married. In fact, he questioned whether he wanted to be in his career, working for this company, living in a city, or even wearing shoes. He thought about making big changes in his life, like growing a beard and retreating to a mountain cabin. But then, loneliness tugged at him. What would he become if he cut himself off from others? Betty, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of her own insecurities, wondering what was so broken inside of her that she couldn't be a normal wife. When he came home late on Wednesday, however, Betty was in the kitchen. She looked at him, loosened tie, messy hair, lipstick on his cheek, smelling of alcohol, and retreated into the dining room, where she had her book. "That's it, I'm broken," she thought. Then he appeared in the doorway. "What?" he said with an energetic edge from the alcohol. "Running away?" "No, Ron," she said, just wondering if this is a choice. "Or if you're just angry with me." He laughed, but said nothing more. Words were just tools that people used to make things seem okay to them, he thought. Now that it has become the topic of the hour, Ron, what is the future for us? Betty looked at him with sincere blue eyes and a calm expression. "I think I ruined it," he said. "There's nothing left. You can't trust me again, and I can't trust myself again. And I can no longer be the husband you need me to be, the one you have complete faith in. Because I can see in your eyes that you won't have that faith, Betty." They're empty. She did not appear surprised or troubled in any way, which surprised Ron. In fact, she seemed to have expected his words. "Let's discuss it in the morning," she said, but both of them knew it wouldn't happen. Instead, their divided house would gradually come back to life, and they would go their separate ways, just as they had when they first met. Ron spent an hour at his desk massaging his temples while drinking copious amounts of iced tea. Slowly, the throbbing in his head subsided and the cottonmouth feeling went away. He had slept poorly, and his mind felt foggy. But luckily, he didn't have any major work to do. He met Greg for lunch. "She makes me feel awful," he told Greg. Sitting there, like an angel, enduring her pain silently, beyond reproach. "She's hurt and I hurt her, and she's being kind just to make me feel terrible, hoping I'll come crawling back. Then, I'll have to be her lapdog." "Sit, Ron. Stay, Ron. Stay home tonight, Ron. Beg, Ron. Nah, there's not much I can do to fix this. Even if she finds someone else, we still won't trust each other, and her perception of me will always be fractured, tainted. Maybe you could just be friends, said Greg. You clearly care about her, otherwise you wouldn't even be entertaining these thoughts. You'd move on, like you did when you had to take the company back. You don't think about those guys anymore. Across town, Aaron and Betty were having a quick lunch in the cafeteria of the medical center next door. And that's how I became a single mom, Aaron said. When I found out I was pregnant, I had to leave school. Was it difficult? Betty asked. I asked a friend at the university, and she said you were a promising student. With a full-ride scholarship, it was definitely challenging, Aaron said, frowning slightly. I work all day, go to school at night, and I don't have weekends free. I used to think I would do things differently, but if I had to do it all over again, I'd make the same choice, because I have my son, Tommy. He's 8 now, a mischievous angel. Well, mischievous, if you believe that boys should be naughty. You know the saying about boys being made of snips, snails, and puppy dog tails. As far as I can tell, people act as if every moment is their last, which makes them think it's an eternity, instead of just a step towards something else with many options along the way. I couldn't imagine my life without my boyfriend, so I let him take advantage of me, and I ended up getting pregnant. Was it bad or good? My child is good, and in another 2 years, I'll be in a better place too. She patted Betty on the leg. No matter what you're going through, it will be okay in the end, she said. You can't change the past, only move forward. In the end, said Betty, the final moment. Back at the barbecue restaurant, where Greg and Ron were enjoying a midday meal, their conversation took a similarly philosophical turn. There are no certainties. We like to believe that love and maybe even God are certain, but I think they're more like gravity and time in relation to velocity and direction. I believe in the Malthus-Eckhart theory, which suggests that humans think linearly and arithmetically, but life operates exponentially and three-dimensionally. This means that we only recognize the parts of reality that consistently repeat until the very last second of time, and we filter out all the other possibilities. This gives us something to work with as a group, which is great at first, but then something unexpected happens, and the failure is exponential. What's interesting is that whatever we did initially seemed like a good option, but ended up not just being a less than ideal choice, but our downfall. This is why humans can be so self-destructive, said Ron slowly. I guess I filtered out everything but what I wanted. I wanted a perfect marriage, but instead I got a wife who was too preoccupied to be there for me, and instead of addressing that, I moved on to something else. Now I can't get back to what I thought was straightforward. I thought I could step out for a few days, then come back to exactly where I was, but it's like a spaceship traveling at light speed, taking decades to reach another planet, and when it returns, thousands of years have passed on Earth. It's like that with my marriage. I was gone for a few days, but I came back and 1,000 years have passed, and now we're strangers to each other. Greg finished his beer, the slightly bitter taste lingering on his tongue. Cheer up, my brother, he said. This won't be forever. Either Betty will crack because you're still better than anyone else, or you'll separate and then I can show you around the world of dating. Nothing is permanent. Well, except for death, I guess, and maybe even that is relative. You mean I might wake up on another planet as a lizard man and still be married to a lizard woman who is Betty? Ron asked, laughing. No, but at some point, the two of you might come together and realize that you have a shared destiny, said Greg. He felt a twinge of something he wanted to express stir within him at his own words, but it slipped away before he could grasp it, and he simply said, Come on, let's get back to your office. Thursday was a slow day due to the unsettled political news and the turbulent economy, causing people to be in a frenzy. Ron couldn't help but feel that instead of living their own lives, people had to react to these distant events. Someone made a decision somewhere, and as a result, a city is destroyed, the economy crashes, or humans land on the moon or Mars. He wished it could all disappear so he could be in silence with his own thoughts, where he had begun to question his ability to trust himself, and therefore his ability to take Betty back. After speaking with a patient who had lost their family in a plane crash, Betty received phone messages canceling her last 2 appointments. She drove home, pondering if survivor's guilt extended to smaller, everyday things. Did she feel guilty for things she didn't even understand? Or was this way of thinking the only path to true love? Betty, feeling unusually down, grabbed a beer from the fridge. If Ron wanted her to pay for it later, she would. She justified drinking it by saying it helped her get in the mood to talk. She had a feeling that a serious conversation about their relationship was on the horizon, and the anticipation made her nervous. Everything seemed ruined, and she couldn't help but be reminded of her parents' disapproving faces. Painting was like reading tarot cards or conjuring, she thought. It allowed her to peer into the future and reflect on the past. A good painting served as a roadmap, showing her how everything would unfold and what it all meant. She saw so much in her future: her children getting married, publishing an article on survivor's guilt, and maybe finally convincing Ron to buy a cabin in the woods, a cottage by the beach, or a boat to travel the world. But now, that picture appeared blurry, slipping away like an image in a rearview mirror as she sped toward unknown destinations in her fast car. A few hours later, Ron quietly entered through the back door to take a quick shower and change into something less formal than his dull gray suit. He checked his personal email and discovered a message from his insurance agency, confirming that both he and Betty had increased their life insurance coverage to a significant amount. He figured it was Betty's way of looking out for their kids. Curiosity piqued. He made his way to her workspace. 2 easels filled the room. One held a strange painting, while the other displayed a book they had given their children many years ago. The book was open to a well-worn page. Ron began reading the words out loud. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses, and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. In his mind, he heard Greg's voice saying, "Women can't live with EM, can't figure them out either." He shifted his attention to the painting classic Betty, with a magnificent white castle standing against a backdrop of blue skies, golden hues, and vibrant spring greens. She had painted something similar in the past. He chuckled. But as his eyes traced the root growing from the tree next to the castle, snaking through a dark world of violets, reds, and silvers, he noticed more. A moon below the root was surrounded by psychedelic paisley plants. Vines in deep forest green stretched across the blazing orange background toward castles on the right and left. As he studied the painting, he contemplated his wife's character. As a man, he often focused on goals and sometimes lost sight of the bigger picture, instead nitpicking flaws. He realized that he had spent too long fixating on Betty's faults instead of seeing her as a whole. He had only seen the dark side of someone who may not have completely loved him, without acknowledging the light and joy she brought into their lives through her actions. When she gave up painting to focus on her career, she lost sight of the bigger picture. She mistakenly believed that the problem lied within her, rather than examining her relationship to the world around her. Ron knew that life wasn't a picture, but this painting held a deeper meaning. The castle on the right had a high window, possibly depicting a man resembling the ancient god Apollo from a museum statue. The castle on the left featured a sunroom where a virtuous maiden with flowing golden hair held a sword. Ron dismissed these features as a product of Betty's creative psyche, gaining a new perspective. After finishing his shower, he dressed up and headed to the Roman holiday. But as he opened the back door, he felt a gaze on him. He turned around to find Betty standing there, wearing a sheer robe. "You could stay," she whispered. "We could forget the past and just be ourselves again. Stop overthinking and focus on what we still have." Ron looked at her intently, his eyes showing a mix of darkness and passion. "I'll only mess it up again," he said. "There's nothing left for me. If you give me love, I'll ruin it. I need a life without things that I can lose because I lack discipline. We can't change the past. There's simply nothing left." He lowered his head slightly and swiftly left through the door, soon forgetting about the situation as he zoomed towards the Roman holiday. As he entered the bar, Marcia called out to him. She was petite, covered in mystical tattoos, had long dark hair, and worked as a security auditor at Google. They often engaged in casual dating with no strings attached. At 2 in the morning, Betty's phone buzzed next to her as she slept on the couch with the light on. A feeling of uncertainty gripped her gut. "Hey, it's Greg," came Greg's voice. "I'm at the Roman holiday, and it's about Ron. Doesn't he have someone there to take care of him?" Betty asked, trying to sound polite. "I mean, isn't he on a date?" "No, she, left with one of the personal trainers from next door. Ron had a few drinks and needs someone to make sure he doesn't get sick. I've, also met someone and will be leaving in a few moments. Can you take Ron home?" It wasn't really a question, but more like a directive. Betty hung up the phone, picked up her car keys and purse, and left the house. To her dismay, her car refused to start in the garage. She recalled seeing battery warnings on her dashboard for the past few mornings, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. She opened a ride-sharing app and arranged for a paid ride to the club. Stepping onto the sidewalk, she was struck not by the indecency of the place, but by its cheapness. The bar was a simple box building with windows resembling an office complex. There were tacky decorations like disco balls, streamers, and silly string to entertain the adults. The music reminded her of something her children would listen to, just with a repetitive techno beat. And the people there? They were attractive, but there was no true handsomeness. It all felt like a sleazy place for mating. All she could think about was Ron, longing for more than this. She paid the exorbitant cover fee and found Ron curled up at the bar, looking pale and unwell. Vomit stained the floor, but no one seemed to notice or care. A strong scent of perfume wafted through the air, probably to mask the smells of sweat, alcohol, and smoke. "Come on, Ron," she said, guiding him towards his car. She retrieved his keys from his pocket. "Hey, beautiful lady, it seems your date isn't doing so well," said a tall man with bulging muscles, a strong jawline, and dark, piercing eyes. "Take him home, and let's have some fun." "No, thank you," Betty replied, smiling politely. "Perhaps another time." "Maybe," the man said, mimicking finger guns at her. Betty let out a sigh and opened the Porsche, gently placing Ron in the passenger seat as she settled into the driver's seat. She pressed the button to lower the top, both to allow fresh air in and to enjoy the beauty of the starry night sky, filled with countless worlds waiting to be explored. Gripping the wheel tightly, she sped away from the parking lot and onto the freeway. The chilly night air rushing past woke Ron up after a few minutes of driving. "Where are we?" he muttered. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," Betty replied reassuringly. Ron became more alert. "Betty, why are you?" She hushed him, running her fingers through his hair. "Rest now. I'll make sure everything turns out all right. It'll be just like how things were before everything went wrong." "I'm so sorry," Ron cried. "I just didn't know what to do, how to fix this. No need to worry," she said cheerfully. She drove past their house around the big loop of the freeway and then started heading back into town. In the distance, she could see the lights on the Sassafras Road Bridge. The powerful engine roared to life. "Where are we going?" asked Ron. "Home," said Betty. "Our new old home. We'll be together forever and we'll be happy again." The car accelerated, reaching 80 and then surpassing 100. Ron fought against the effects of alcohol, desperately trying to stay awake and understand why the streetlights were passing by so quickly. Betty switched into the left lane and pressed the accelerator even harder. In Ron's confused mind, a poem kept playing on repeat. Much like the futile attempt to make sense of his mistake and her forgiveness, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses, and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. She gently touched his hair. Ron whimpered. Over the sound of the wind, Betty thought she heard her mother's voice saying, "You'll become successful, pursue your own career, pay taxes, and have a loving partner." She thought she heard Samantha whispering as Ron hugging her gently. She heard Aaron speak about how time couldn't be undone. She visualized her painting taking shape, the colors blending into beautiful forms and textures for the final stroke. She remembered Ron saying, "I care about you," in the courtyard of their college many years ago. Betty let her hand rest on his knee. His hand gripped hers. "We're going home, Ron," she said, as the Sassafras Road Bridge loomed larger and larger in front of them, the steering wheel pointing directly toward it.